Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. In this segment, no exception. We're going to be talking to Melvin Alan Goodman, well respected in the national security and intelligence area. Indeed, he has served as many things. He began in the U.S. Army working as a cryptographer. He then worked as an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency from 66 to 74. And he transferred to the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where he spent the next 2 years working as a senior analyst. He returned to the CIA in 76, serving as division chief and senior analyst as the Office of Soviet Affairs until leaving in 86. Then he served as an intelligence advisor to the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. He went on to teach at the National War College through 2004 and currently is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. That is a mouthful. Melvin, how are you, my friend?
Thank you, Warner. Thanks for that introduction. I didn't realize I'd done all that.
Yeah, it makes me kind of tired thinking about it, quite frankly.
Yeah, well, it makes me think, well, is this an obituary or is this an introduction?
Well, here's what we know. It's the only thing going on this radio program at this time, so we're going to make it very, very good. Your history, your career, your concerns are that of national security and over our ability to keep the country safe and also know what the heck's going on around the world. From whence you started until now, give our national security community, give the intelligence community a grade, if you would, A to F, and why?
Well, I have to give the intelligence community a grade of F for three reasons. One, the operational side. If you look at the history of covert actions and the CIA role in regime change and political assassination, every one has been a failure and every one has marked a strategic setback. Two, I give them a grade of F because of intelligence analysis, and particularly the politicization of intelligence, which is why I left the CIA in the first place in 1986 when Bill Casey was director and Bob Gates intelligence issues, the Soviet Union in the 1980s, the flawed national intelligence estimate about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction, which led us into war in 2003 in Iraq, which helps to explain the current chaos in the Middle East. But three, the worst grade in terms of that F, and trying to explain that F, is the failure of the moral compass. That would be CIA secret prisons, CIA torture and abuse, CIA renditions, and erroneous detentions. And then finally, you have an episode now that no one seems to be concerned about, which is the CIA violation of the constitutional separation of powers by breaking into a Senate computer, removing documents, and using false identities to read the emails of congressional staffers. So the F has been earned. And it's not going to change until you get a president who is serious about intelligence, serious about the CIA, and puts an adult in as control of the CIA. And we don't have an adult now with John Brennan.
Mel, how much of this is there politics, meaning would you necessarily give the Republican Party and Republican administrations higher grades versus Democratic, or is that really not a factor in this issue at all?
For me, it's a bipartisan F. The only president who had it right was Harry Truman. When Harry Truman created the CIA in 1947, he made it clear he wanted this to be the intelligence arm of the White House. He wanted a place to go to for objective, balanced, and truthful intelligence. Truth is, of course, an elusive commodity, but objectivity and balance should be attainable. And in 1963, it's not well known, but he wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post decrying what had happened to the CIA that he wanted to create, being very critical, essentially, of President Eisenhower and the coup in Iran, which helps to explain our current problems with Iran 60 years later, and, of course, John F. Kennedy in the Bay of Pigs. That's not what Harry Truman had in mind. He didn't want this cloak and dagger operation, and when you look at the cloak and dagger operations, they've all screwed up American foreign policy. Your listeners should really go watch a movie that's out there now. John le Carré wrote the book. The movie is The Most Wanted Man. Philip Seymour Huffman, the late Philip Seymour Huffman, plays a German intelligence agency agent, and it shows all of the flaws of intelligence services, whether they're in Germany or Russia or the United States. It's a very important movie. So the F is a bipartisan F.
In fairness, is the Central Intelligence Agency, is it given proper direction and it just goes on its merry way, or is everybody up and down the food chain there, a mess?
Great question, because when you look at the CIA flaws on operations, every one of those operations that I'm critical of, and I wrote a book, The Failure of Intelligence, The Decline and Fall of the CIA, that explains all these failures, every one was directed by the White House. The CIA was not a rogue elephant out of control, which is what Senator Frank Church called it in the 1970s, and he admitted he was wrong about that, but the hearings were good hearings. But these were White House-directed coups, regime changes, political assassinations. It was Eisenhower who said, get Lumumba. It was Nixon who wanted to overthrow the government in Chile, Kennedy who thought the Bay of Pigs was a good idea. So the White House has not provided the kind of leadership, and the Congress has really not done a great job of oversight. In fact, again, I'd be bipartisan here, and when I say the Democratic chairman, like Dianne Feinstein, the current one, is as bad as the Republican chairman, such as Pat Roberts, in the past. So if the government would just do its damn job of providing leadership by the White House and oversight by the Congress, then maybe you could get a CIA that would honor a moral compass. Right now, you don't have that.
What about, again, has the nature of the work with the Internet and with more sophisticated, at least, machinery and technology, is the job of Central Intelligence made easier, or is it made more complicated and more difficult because, in essence, the enemy, so to speak, has some of that same tools at their disposal?
Again, it's another good question, another good point. It's a little bit of each, because with all of this social media and all of these data points, it's like drinking water out of a fire hydrant. I think intelligence analysts are overwhelmed with the kind of information that they get. But I think the flaw is they do a very poor and unadventurous and unimaginative job of interpreting intelligence. Think of all the recent intelligence failures. And I'm not talking about politicization. These are intentional failures, such as the Soviet Union in the 80s or the Iraq War in 2002, 2003. But look at the legitimate failures. Look at ISIS right now in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq, this army of 10 to 17,000 insurgents, not anticipated by the intelligence community. Look at the Arab Spring in 2010, not anticipated by the intelligence community. Look at what the Russians have been doing in Crimea and now eastern Ukraine. Again, took the intelligence community by surprise. These are too many failures, and they continue. So again, there's a hell of a lot of information. In fact, the point that I think the public should understand, and maybe feel good about, but it's a little bit of each, a little bit of good, a little bit of bad. CIA does an incredibly good job of intelligence collection. So does the National Security Agency. So does the National Reconnaissance Office. The real flaw is in the analysis, and that's where I work, frankly. So it pains me to say this, but going back to Pearl Harbor, the intelligence was there to prevent Pearl Harbor. 9/11, the intelligence was there to prevent 9/11. 9/11 should not have happened the way it did on that terrible day. But again, the intelligence analysis is either so flawed or so unimaginative that we get one failure after another. But if anything, it's too much information.
What would those that do oversee the CIA, would they agree with you? Do you feel like you're kind of as they say, a candle in the wind here, a rogue here with this opinion, or is this something that's shared by a lot of people? And what I'm wondering is, you seem to be giving kudos to those that gather it, but once it gets inside the house, they really don't know what to do with it. And
that's
is that
exactly
universal?
What I'm saying, but the problem is I feel like a contrarian, or sometimes when I speak, and I do a lot of public speaking, I'm introduced as a dissident. I shouldn't be a contrarian. I shouldn't be a dissident. I still think this is conventional wisdom. And when I sit down with people, and I've done this on the Hill with congressional staffers, they're very sympathetic to what I have to say, but there's so much cynicism out there that leads people to throw up their hands and say, but how are we going to change this? Well, if you don't start to begin the process of change or begin the process of reform, you're never going to make any improvements. And my quarrel with this administration, and I was a huge Obama supporter in both 2008 and 2012, but he's done a terrible job in this area. He is not really trying to reform the CIA. He's appointed directors who were not up to the task. Leon Panetta was one, a tired bureaucrat. He failed. David Petraeus, of course, committed political suicide and had to leave. John Brennan I know John Brennan. We came into the CIA about the same time. I guess I was a little before him. But he shouldn't be the CIA director. He was a cheerleader to many of the things the CIA did that were wrong or unethical. But my problem with Obama is he seems intimidated by the Pentagon and the intelligence community, and he really hasn't put the proper controls or reforms in place that would reverse the militarization of intelligence that we've seen over the last 10 years.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to Melvin Allen Goodman. Mel Goodman, he's a national security and intelligence expert, well-traveled and well-versed in these subjects. He's worked for the CIA and the State Department, along with many other things, and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Mel, you talk about certain things, Pearl Harbor, 9/11 should not have happened. It begs the question, at what point, if 9/11 isn't a wake-up call, as an example, what in the world is going to be? And why do we, in your opinion, why are we continue to be asleep at the wheel on this one?
I don't know, but, 9/11 was an incredible wake-up call. CIA torture and abuse, something that I never thought this country would ever be doing, should have been a wake-up call. Abu Ghraib, the military torture and abuse, should have been a wake-up call. You have to wonder, what would it take before the American people realize that these are public agencies? Okay, they're secret, but the public finances these agencies, and the public has to start calling congressional people and congressional staffers to make their voices heard. So I don't know, frankly, what it would take, because 9/11 was clearly a shock to the psyche. Last month I was in New York and finally got to the 9/11 Memorial and 9/11 Museum, which I think all people should do to understand what happened, and then get into the reasons of why it happened, which the museum really doesn't do a good job of, but maybe that was too controversial for them, to realize that the intelligence community really let us down on 9/11. Any time there's a military attack or a terrorist attack on the United States, that's an intelligence failure by definition. There really doesn't need to be a big argument after that. The debate, to me, is over. But if you look at the 9/11 Commission report, which was a politicized document, it didn't really get into the real problems and what led to the 9/11 disaster. It was very protective of the CIA. They even allowed CIA people who were apologists, of course, for their former agency to serve on the 9/11 Commission. And there were a couple of Harvard people who've long been apologists for the CIA, such as Philip Zelikow, who was at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. So there's too much cover-up. There's not enough accountability. There's not enough responsibility. And I think this is at the core of the problem.
All right, Mel, we give you, because of your background and because of your passion for this, we give you the magic wand, and we say, all right, fix it, or at least head us in the right direction. What are the first few things that you do?
Well, the first thing that you need to do is to put a person in who understands the role of strategic intelligence, going back to Harry Truman's original purposes for having a CIA in the first place. And maybe this is a difficult task, but we've appointed people who know nothing about strategic intelligence, know very little about what policymakers need in terms of intelligence. So someone like a retired ambassador, Thomas Pickering, who was a career ambassador and one of the best ambassadors in the history of the State Department Foreign Service, could be a very good CIA director. To put a military figure in, which is what Obama did, what George W. Bush did, what Jimmy Carter did, this is going to the wrong place for strategic intelligence. I was in the Army for 3 years as a cryptographer. I taught at the National War College for 18 years and have worked on this problem. And I don't think the military understands the role of strategic intelligence. They're operational people, they're tactical people, they're good at what they do. But in terms of strategic understanding, I wouldn't go to the military. You're not going to find another General Eisenhower or a General George C. Marshall in the military these days. I just don't think they exist. So it's leadership, and it's leadership that will restore the moral compass. Again, what Harry Truman talked about when he created the CIA in 1947. And then finally, you need more competition within intelligence units. There's been a tendency to centralize intelligence and go to only one place for your intelligence, and that's not the way you're going to produce good intelligence. So it might create some redundancy, and there might be some wasted expenditure in terms of redundancy, but without the competition, I don't think you're going to get the cream rising to the top. So that I think that's what needs to be done.
Do you feel that historically, are we lagging behind compared to the rest of the world community? Are we staying ahead a little bit in spite of ourselves, or are we dangerously behind at this point?
Well, if you want to compare the CIA to other intelligence services, frankly, I'd probably defend the CIA. From a standpoint of technology, there is no country out there, no group of countries out there that can match the technological achievements of the United States and the intelligence community. But there are intelligence services that do a better job of devil's advocacy to try to keep the intelligence analyst honest. Israel had a very expensive lesson with the October 1973 war. That was their Pearl Harbor. And they created components of devil's advocacy to argue for what was possibly the unthinkable and trying to challenge conventional wisdom. So I think probably some of the smaller intelligence agencies do a better job of that. But if you're looking at the larger intelligence agencies, no agency gets the funding that the CIA gets. The CIA spends more for intelligence than the rest of the world does on intelligence. And you have to keep that in mind. We spend far too much, and there are savings there that we haven't really looked for, again, because Obama's intimidation by the right wing and the national security community. So we could do far better with somewhat less. And I would say the same thing about the military. My last book was National Insecurity, The Cost of American Militarism. Again, we spend as much on our military as the rest of the world combined. What do we have to show for it? The world is out of control. We think we're a superpower. The fact of the matter is we're powerless to deal with the conditions that prevail now in this chaotic international situation we're in, particularly in the Middle East.
Now, that was want to be one of my follow-ups here as we start to wind down here a little bit. From where you stand, from your career and just where you are as sort of a student of all of this, is there one particular area of the world, is there one particular area of concern that you feel is absolutely the big priority for our national intelligence community?
Well, the major target will have to be China, but the danger there is exaggerating the threat, which is what we did with the Soviet Union for 20 to 30 years before the Soviet Union collapsed under our noses and gave us a strategic opportunity that we didn't take advantage of. And actually, to a certain extent, we're doing the same thing with China. We're exaggerating the potential of China. If you look at China in terms of diplomacy, economy, their military, maybe they're number two to us in terms of their economy, but they have extremely serious problems in all of these areas. But over the long term, as our focus becomes more on Asia, we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to China. But the challenge will be making China a stakeholder, not necessarily a global threat. But if you want to look at an apocalyptic scenario that's going to take up all of our resources and we're going to find very little to gain, then it's the terrible Middle Eastern situation. It's having an intransigent Israel that's complicating American interest and American foreign policy. It's the inability to deal with Israel politically because of the domestic situation that Israel presents, particularly for democratic administrations. It's the fact that you have states breaking down in terms of dysfunctional and failed states that barely exist anymore. Syria is hardly a nation. Iraq is hardly a nation. Lebanon is hardly a nation. Jordan is kept together by welfare payments from rich oil monarchies. It's a pathetic situation, and we fail to learn that just because because we introduced military force, that's not the answer. We introduced military force in Libya. The Libyan situation is worse now than before we went in. We introduced military force in Iraq. Iraq now is worse than before we went in. I don't know what we thought we were doing in Afghanistan over the past 10 years. We went in originally, it was with 450 troops and CIA operatives. They did a damn good job in 2 months, and we should have turned the keys over to the Afghans then and said, look, this is your country, do what you want, but don't let the terrorists back in. So we took a very simple problem and made it very difficult. So the Middle East scares the hell out of me because it's totally chaotic.
Right.
It's totally unpredictable, and Obama has not surrounded himself with serious expertise. He has a fondness for loyalty, collegiality, and surrounding himself with pals. So you get a national security advisor such as Susan Rice, who's just not qualified for that job,
right.
But he's obviously comfortable with her. And it's his comfort level that's, I think, getting in the way of good policy right now.
Yeah. Well, these are subjects, if you thought too much about them, you might not ever sleep. But we have been talking to Mel Goodman, well-known, highly regarded national security expert. He is also a teacher as well, but has spent many, many years in national intelligence serving the country. Mel, you're also the author of many books and articles, et cetera. How can people find out more about some of the work that you do?
Yeah, I'm on at ciponline.org, ciponline.org. And if you go to the national security template, you'll find all of my writings. But if you Google, just Google my name, a lot of the writings will come out.
All right.
They'll pop up on Google.
Well, listen, thank you so much for your observations and insights here. Appreciate it, and would love to have you back on again sometime.
I'd love to. I really enjoyed this. Thanks for the conversation.
Great. You'll bet we will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.